Good evening. My name is Katie Zontak, and I'm the Cultural Arts Director at the JCC in Buffalo, New York. I would like to welcome you all to tonight's event, which is part of the Cultural Arts Celebration 2021 series, sponsored by Moment Magazine. The Cultural Arts Department at the JCC in Buffalo supports 2 art galleries and presents an annual book and arts fair and film festival. Additionally, we offer cultural arts programs such as concerts, family programs, adult discussion groups, and workshops throughout the year that showcase Jewish culture. We look to expand our programming through partnerships and are grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with Moment Magazine tonight. Moment Magazine, co-founded by Elie Wiesel and Leonard Fine almost 45 years ago, is an independent magazine that illuminates the complexities of the literary, political, cultural, religious nuances of the Jewish world. Every issue is packed with smart, trustworthy articles and analysis, exclusive arts and literary reviews, fiction, humor, and the ever-popular Ask the Rabbi feature, plus more. We encourage you to get to know them better at momentmag.com. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd like to just remind everybody that we will do a Q&A after the presentation, so please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A pop-up box throughout the event. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Amy Schwartz, presenting tonight's event, Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, covering education, science, and culture, and where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary in 1988 and was a 3-time winner of the Newspaper Guild's Bernie Harrison Memorial Award for commentary and criticism. She has also worked at Harper's Magazine, The New Republic, and the Wilson Quarterly. Amy is the president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington, D.C., and speaks and runs workshops on topics of Jewish commentary, Psalms, and literature nationwide. So thank you, Amy, for joining us. I'm looking forward to the event tonight, and I will now virtually pass you the microphone.
Thanks so much, Katie. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for having me and for signing on. I'm very happy to be here to talk about my book, Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life, and also about my adventures editing the column it's drawn from, Moment Magazine's Ask the Rabbis. I come to you from Washington, D.C., and without getting us off the track, I will say that it's a very good place from which to observe the necessity of modeling a way for people to disagree in a civil, polite way without resorting to violence. So the best way for me to explain what we're trying to do with the Ask the Rabbis column is to give you an illustration. Has anyone ever asked you, so can Jews get tattoos? Or, so what do Jews think happens to you after you die? If this has actually ever happened to you, you probably answered in best online fashion, well, it's complicated. You get the feeling you might be talking for a long time. And any discussion of what Jews think of anything is likely to be a long conversation. Now, turn it around. Let's say you have a question. Instead of just Googling it or asking someone this question, you decide you're going to put this question to 10 different rabbis. You'll get answers all right. In fact, you'll get so many answers that you'll probably end up with a whole lot of brand new questions. In other words, you'll come away with a dose of specifically Jewish and very important wisdom. So that's what we try to do with Ask the Rabbis. Every issue at Moment where I'm the opinion and book editor, as Katie said, we try to think of an interesting question that will spark reflection by readers and rabbis alike. And then we put it to a whole spectrum of rabbis, usually from 10 different denominations. Did you know there were 10 different denominations in Judaism? Our rabbis range all the way from humanist, renewal, reconstruction, reform, conservative, and across to modern Orthodox, regular Orthodox, Sephardic, and Chabad. We don't usually get rabbis from the more traditional denominations than Chabad for reasons that I can talk about later. So we ask them to answer this question, and here's the trick, in 200 words or less. They hate that. 200-word answers are not most rabbis' default mode, let's just say. But the results never fail to amaze. We've asked the rabbis all kinds of questions, and many of them are in this book, including, of course, the title question, can robots be Jewish? We've asked them the two questions I mentioned at the beginning, can Jews get tattoos, and do Jews believe in an afterlife? Spoiler, there is no clear answer to what Jews believe on either of these questions. We've asked the rabbis to apply Jewish law or tradition to contemporary problems. For instance, what does Jewish tradition think about organ donation or about editing our children's genes? We've asked them if Jewish tradition offers any guidance for battling drug addiction or for coming out as transgender. We've asked the rabbis, should Jewish children sing Christmas carols? We've asked them, are Jews still expecting a Messiah? We've asked them, are there things that can't be forgiven? And we've even asked them questions that are sort of about politics. For instance, are we commanded to vote? Of course, there's a lot of disagreement. No one denomination has all the answers. The sum of Jewish insight on any question is greater than its parts. And what's interesting to me anyway, and I think to the readers, is that the disagreements don't always come out the way you'd think. Sometimes, as you'd expect, the liberal rabbis disagree with the Chabad rabbis. Sometimes the rabbis at the two ends of the spectrum agree with each other, but they disagree with the ones in the middle. Sometimes they all agree on the answer to the question, but they all give different reasons and cite different texts. Sometimes they cite the same text, but with opposite meanings. These rabbis are a fabulous array. I love them. At the one end, we have humanist rabbis who go out of their way in nearly every answer to sort of name check their brand and to say that, by the way, we do not believe in God or any supernatural being. That seems to be the most important thing to them. It's a small denomination. At the other end, we have Orthodox and Hasidic rabbis who so revere God that they won't spell out the name of God. They spell it G-D, so as to echo the practice in Hebrew of avoiding pronouncing the divine name. So far so good, right? So this is familiar. So okay, but then we also have renewal rabbis. Jewish renewal is a kind of a neo-Hasidic but very politically liberal denomination. So some of the renewal rabbis resonate to the emotional and spiritual practices of Hasidism, and some of them like this practice of not writing the name of God, but they've taken to spelling God G!D. So I think this is really kind of cool. It's very tough on moments proofreaders. In fact, when I first came into this job 10 years ago, one of my first real, I felt, signal successes was winning an argument with a proofreader who was absolutely distraught over this, who said, this magazine has form and God has to be spelled a particular way and we can't spell it G!D. So, and I was able to convince her that actually that was the whole point of this feature, that the rabbis would all spell God in different ways. So why are we doing this? I mean, are we playing some kind of rabbi gotcha game? Of course not. Partly, we want to it's a good way to make accessible to a regular lay non-rabbi reader the rich debates that have raged throughout Jewish tradition and are still raging today. But there's also a deeper reason. And to explain that, I have to take you back to a familiar and beloved scene from Fiddler on the Roof. I'm sure everyone knows it. So in this scene, Tevye is trying to mediate an argument between a conservative villager and a young radical, Perchik, who later becomes his son-in-law, who's just gotten off the train. And Perchik is saying, and the villager is saying, what do we care what they say in Kiev? And Tevye says, you're right. And Perchik says, what do you mean? How can you ignore what other people think in the world? Tevye says, he's right. And so a third villager looks at Tevye and says, he's right and he's right. How can they both be right? And Tevye thinks about this and he says, you're also right. So to me, it's all there in that one exchange, the Jewish love of argument and the fundamental Jewish ethic of tolerance for differing views. These are the two values that animate this collection. We wanted to give a window with our book, doing a book on this. We wanted to give a window on the incredible breadth and vitality of Jewish religious insight on issues that are as old as human weakness and as urgently relevant as today's news. These are old texts that are absolutely relevant in this very alive, unpredictable way. Now, I also don't have to tell you, especially this week, that the principle of tolerance for argument has been deeply unpopular of late. But it's deeply, deeply Jewish, and that won't change because of something that's happening in the news. We've all heard the joke about the shipwrecked Jewish sailor who's alone on a desert island, so he builds two synagogues, one where he prays and one that he won't set foot in. So, beyond this zest for disputation, and maybe essential to it, to keeping the whole thing going, is a spirit of generosity, the sense that you could always learn something from somebody else's opinion. This principle predates Tevye by some millennia. Argument in Judaism is not just a positive value, it's actually considered a mode of worship. Multiple opinions are given. Traditional text study is done in pairs, the better to thrash things out as you go along. And dispute is always accompanied by respect. The Talmud, recounting a debate between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, reports that a heavenly voice ends the argument by saying, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These and these are the words of the living God. The heavenly voice then rules in Hillel's favor, but the reference to these and these is cited approvingly throughout the tradition, in one case with the added comment, this is a principle for all of Torah. Today, too, the principle of Elu ve'elu sets the stage for a drama that continues unchecked in the pages of Talmud, in study sessions on Zoom, in sessions about study sessions like this one. Interpreters of Jewish life and tradition continue to argue in the spirit of worship. And even if toleration of the other person's opinion seems further and further out of reach sometimes, it remains the ideal for which we strive. So, okay, that was a lot of theory. Let me show you how this particular book works it in practice. Here are a couple of my favorite examples from the book. The book is a selection of 30 of our best questions. Over 15 years, we've had, I think, 90 questions. I picked my favorite 30, and how they illustrate these kinds of fruitful disagreements. The book is split in 6 sections: science, sex, modern life, politics, values, and the nature of the universe. Within each one, we've selected questions across a number of years. So snapshots not only of different views, but of different times in the life of this argument. So the most dramatic, predictable pattern, as I mentioned before, is one where you'd see a steady spectrum from yes to no, or no to yes. And you'll see that in one of the questions I started with: can Jews get tattoos? Or as we phrased it in the magazine, are tattoos and body piercings taboo? It was one of the first questions asked way back when the feature got started, along with another one that showed a similar response, which was, should Jewish children sing Christmas carols? It's significant. These are both, as you know, not questions about Jewish law or history or something that has one right answer, but questions about custom, tradition, and usage. So, on tattoos, the one thing all the rabbis agreed on, from independent to Chabad, was no, having a tattoo will not bar you from being buried in a Jewish cemetery, no matter what your Hebrew school teacher told you. But that's about the extent of their disagreement. Let me read a couple excerpts. The humanist, Rabbi Peter Schweitzer, in this case, says tattoos should be, quote, entirely an individual matter, unquote. The renewal rabbi, Laura Duan Kaplan, says, Torah clearly forbids tattooing and self-cutting as ways of mourning or memorializing. However, Torah also implies that piercings can be opportunities for good or bad. The Israelite men donated their earrings to build the golden calf, but the Israelite women donated theirs to build the Mishkan, the sanctuary. So that's a characteristic note, I think, of the denomination is don't just look at whether something's allowed or not. You know, what's the context of your action? What's the meaning you bring to it? So moving on across the spectrum, the conservative rabbi, in this instance, the conservative rabbi was Rabbi Julie Schoenfeld, says, to characterize the issue to young people as taboo misses a crucial opportunity to convey Jewish affirmations of the fundamental dignity of the human being. The conservative position on tattooing states that while we discourage the practice, no sanctions are imposed. So the teachable moment, again, a classic conservative Jewish stance. We don't like it, but we're not going to discipline you for it. The Sephardic rabbi, Joshua Maruf, took the quote more literally. He said, and he goes on to explain why. He says, tattoos are indeed forbidden by the Torah. The human body is a wondrous manifestation of God's master design. Hijacking the body and transforming it into an artistic canvas or a vehicle for expression distorts those fundamental principles and leads us to believe we can cast aside the divine image and fashion ourselves after the image of our choice. So you could call that a cultural argument. Don't do what the culture around you says you can do with your body. That's going astray. The Chabad rabbi simply says, tattoos are not kosher. The laws are detailed in the Shulchan Aruch and in Rambam under idolatry. So that's an unusually clear example. Typically, and I've made it clearer by excerpting. But another very different but still classic pattern is the afterlife question, in which not only do the rabbis disagree on whether there's an afterlife, they also disagree on whether Jews think there is an afterlife. The independent rabbi says, some Jews do, some Jews don't believe this. The humanist says, most people I know believe this is the only life we'll ever know. Yet this doesn't negate the idea of an afterlife. He then takes up questions of what could an afterlife mean, how people remember you, legacy you leave in somebody's resemblance, things like that. The Reconstructionist says congregants asking about an afterlife are mostly seeking reassurance that a loved one is not entirely gone. And he's then in his pastoral mode, he then talks about different responses you can give that meet a need of a congregant. The Orthodox rabbi says, belief in an afterlife, a world to come in which the righteous get their true reward and the wicked get their deserved comeuppance, is a central teaching of traditional Judaism. So it's one of the 13 principles of faith laid out by Maimonides, to believe in the world to come. The Sephardic rabbi says, and listen carefully and see how many, what's the word I'm looking for? How many qualifiers you can find in this. There is little doubt, not no doubt, but little doubt, that Jews in biblical times subscribed to a belief in some kind of life after death. And then the Chabad rabbi, in this case, the Chabad rabbi was a well-known name, Shmuley Boteach, who later was kicked out of the Chabad movement, but that's a whole other story, says, consistent with its this world orientation, Judaism does believe in an afterlife, but remarkably, that afterlife is here on this earth. So I think we come from this range of opinions not only with a mirror of our own searchings, which is helpful, but also reassured by, as the Reconstructionist rabbi says, this is to be expected for a question in which, by the time we know for sure, it'll be too late to tell. So a pattern of a very different kind, and one of my personal favorites, emerges from the question, what does the Torah teach us about addiction? This was one of my favorite questions. I wrote this one, and I was quite pleased with it, because obviously the Torah says nothing directly about drug addiction. It's all a question of metaphors and inferences. So the independent rabbi, Gershon Winkler, I should say, the reason this particular rabbi who writes for us regularly, affiliates with no denomination, but he runs an outfit called the Walking Stick Foundation, where he takes people on walks through nature and talks to them about Jewish text. So he starts by he draws a lesson about addiction from the story of the golden calf. On Sinai, he says, here's the quote, the one who spoke and the world came into being, that is God, instructed us not to get so caught up in our subjective assumptions about God that we would carve out and worship an image reflecting those assumptions. Addiction is the act of replacing a truth or a need or an innate desire with an artificial facsimile that eventually supersedes that truth. So he says, once you are hooked on this kind of artificial image, this idol, you have to be melted down like the idol to escape the addiction of self-regard. The humanist rabbi, Peter Schweitzer in this case, talks about Cain and Abel. He says in Genesis chapter 4, God has accepted Abel's offering but rejected the one from Cain. Yet God doesn't give up on Cain. He offers him some straight talk. Quote, this is God talking, why are you angry? If you are to do what is good, shouldn't you hold your head high? And if you don't do what is good, sin is crouching at the door. It wants you, but you can rule over it. He adds, the rabbi adds, temptation is there, always ready to pounce, always ready to snare us so we say the wrong word or waste time or self-medicate with alcohol or drugs or even too much junk food. But we can also be master over it, not because we resort to prayer or turn to a higher power to pull us through. That is not what God says to Cain, but because we can take charge of our own actions. The first step is acknowledging our human nature. So, going on, the conservative rabbi, Amy Walk Katz, Says the journey of the Israelites from Egypt, their narrow place, is a depiction of the journey from addiction to recovery. The Jews backslide, they rebel, but somehow they always struggle onward. Okay, that's an interesting variety of images. Here's where it gets more interesting. The renewal rabbi, Rabbi Goldie Milgram, talks about Shabbat as a rebuke to addiction, to work, or anything else you can't step away from. Shabbat is the prescription for how to not be too attached to any particular thing. So exactly so does the modern Orthodox rabbi Yitz Greenberg, says exactly the same thing about Shabbat. The Reform rabbi, Rabbi Sari Laufer, takes as her starting point the story of Noah, who emerges from the ark, sees the destroyed world, and immediately gets blind drunk. So the same story is what comes to mind for the Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Shais Taub, who has written some books on addiction. I turn to him specifically. He writes very movingly of, quote, in reference to Noah, of, quote, the pain of self-awareness on one hand and of self-obliteration on the other. And he concludes that addiction is but the human condition writ large. We're only happy once we get over ourselves. And that is recovery from addiction. When I realize that the only way I can truly function is through extreme selflessness and surrender to a power greater than myself. Now you'll notice he has come out 180 degrees opposed to the humanist who says it's specifically not about a power greater than oneself. It's about grasping one's human nature. And yet, somehow to me, both rabbis seem to speak to the same emotional image of the human being, fighting his weaknesses, cowering before the void. So in that sense, I think although the vocabularies these rabbis use are all different, in some sense they are echoing each other on what really matters. So there are lots of other places where the rabbis agree. There are some surprises. The rabbis were surprisingly in agreement and surprisingly liberal on two questions that are in our public life quite fraught. One is, when does life begin? Which I put in the science section, although obviously it's a question that's asked about abortion policy. And, quote, does Jewish tradition offer any guidance on contraception? The answers to these questions show the rabbis caught in the warring currents of contemporary politics, but not at all in the way you'd think. On when does life begin, this is generally known but often not discussed. The sources that are cited, including the ultra-Orthodox rabbi from Aish HaTorah, all agree that Jewish law does not consider the fetus a human life before 40 days of pregnancy, although they disagree about afterwards. They all cite a text saying that the Talmud says before that the fetus is not a human being but merely water. We asked this question in 2009, and at that time, even the most Orthodox parts of the community were very straightforward about having a different view on this from prevailing sort of evangelical Christian doctrine of people with whom they were otherwise politically aligned. You see a lot of back and forth on that now. I found myself wondering, would Aish HaTorah really say that today? And then just a couple of weeks ago, I was looking at an article by the spokesperson, the rabbi who speaks for Agudat Israel, which is the umbrella group for the Haredi, and he made the same point about disagreement. So I had to hand it to them. That continues to be true. But consider we asked a similarly sensitive question in 2014 about contraception. We got a range of answers, although really expressed more in terms of emphasis than in terms of underlying law. All agreed that the general Jewish law is to the male, not the female, is commanded to reproduce, and ideally at least one of each gender, but not the woman. And what was interesting about this question was that we were missing, you can see in the book, we're missing one of our regulars. There's no Chabad answer. And this was the result of a stalemate with a rabbi that I had called to see if he would find somebody who would answer that question for me. And he came back to me and said, we really think a woman should answer this question. We're not comfortable with a man ruling on this question. And I said, he said, I'd like to connect you up with a really learned woman who can talk to you about this. And I said, well, this is a rabbi's feature. It needs to be a rabbi. And he said, well, I promise you, these women, they're just as good as rabbis. So I didn't want to be rude, but my feeling, well, that's Chabad's problem, not my problem. But in the end, so I said, no, it has to be a rabbi. So in the end, he said, we'd rather just skip it. I hope you understand. Which, whether this was because Chabad didn't want to be in print taking an unpopular position, or a severe position, or whether they didn't want to be in print taking a liberal position, I wasn't able to ascertain. But I thought it was interesting, and I feel as if the limits on elu ve'elu, these and these, the limits are different for everybody. It's not just them. I mean, everyone has limits on how much disagreement they're willing to entertain. So there have been all kinds of surprises. The transgender question was a big surprise. It turns out that the rabbis of the Talmud, going back to the 2nd century, recognized, or at least had names for, up to 5 different genders, which certainly was not something I would have expected. For years, so I'll just wrap up by saying, for years, Ask the Rabbis has been readers' favorite part of the magazine. They always tell us that they turn to it first, except for rabbis themselves, who sometimes don't. And I feel like no wonder. I've been editing this feature for a decade, and the rabbis' answers never fail to amaze and inspire me. From the 5 genders to the fact that the golem, the inspiration for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein monster may very well have been the Jewish folktale of the golem, which is alluded to in the title question, which I'm sure we'll get to the title question in the questions and answers, because it always comes up. You can read right through this book, or you can browse and look things up in it, and you'll learn just as much from the disagreements as from the occasional agreements. Whether you agree or disagree, every answer will teach you something, and together, we hope, they'll give you a glimpse into a vast treasure trove of Jewish argument and Jewish wisdom. And now I would be happy to take some questions. I should say some more questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. So yes, everybody, just a reminder, you can go ahead and send any questions that you have for Amy through the Q&A, or if you're more comfortable with the chat, feel free to send them our way, and we'll pass them over to Amy. Amy, I had a question, just wondering, what is the process of selecting the rabbis? Like, do you just have kind of some go-to, or?
So
Yeah.
I inherited a panel of regulars.
Okay.
When I came into the job, we had been working regularly every issue with a certain number of rabbis, including our modern Orthodox Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who's really a huge figure in modern Orthodoxy. He's been very very significant, and so we're always happy to have him. He also wrote an intro for the book, a foreword to the collection. Sometimes we use regulars, and some of them we rotate through. And for instance, the Reconstructionists, we have 2 or 3 different rabbis that we use in rotation. And some of the denominations are kind of open call, and for renewal, for instance, we have different rabbis every time, depending on who well, I mean, I have a list in my head of people who are especially eloquent on certain kinds of topics. There's, as I've gone through the years, I've come to know which rabbis have written books on certain subjects and which ones, and sometimes there are specific subjects, like for instance, the transgender question. We wanted some rabbis who knew something about that topic, and in fact, at least one of the rabbis we asked was in fact transgender. I was only able to locate one transgender rabbi in North America. I'm sure there are more by now. So the thing about the tricky part is, I mean, I mentioned that you have to answer this question in 200 words, and I'll just say that it's harder than it looks. Not all rabbis really take to this comfortably, even if they're interested. Often we'll have rabbis asking if they could do this feature, and they'll try it out. And some of them, not all of them, find they like it, and not all of them can capture some rabbis. It's not just about your opinion, I mean, you want a mix of sort of, you really want these rabbis to be able to put a whole lot of argument into a nutshell. And it's really difficult to do. And that's one reason we use regulars, because we have discovered that some people are really, really good at this. And so we turn to them as often as we can. So that's the process. Once in a while, if we really want someone, but they don't have time to write, sometimes I'll just interview them. But we try not to do that regularly because it really is supposed to be their voices.
Thank you. I did just have a question come through. Are there any questions that are taboo to ask? You kind of started to touch a little bit on, what people will say and won't say, but
Right. Well, I mean, right. There are subjects that are awkward for some denominations and not others. The question. I mean, I would say as a journalistic enterprise, we like to think that we can ask anything. There's nothing. We're not going to back off of any questions because they're sensitive. We love a question that we want to get people a little bit, kind of rile them up a little bit if we can. Um, we asked a question a couple of years ago in the general, sort of around the time of the Harvey Weinstein trials. It's not in the book, but we asked a question: how would you counsel a sexual predator? Um, and I must say, I never before in my experience of rabbis had I heard so many rabbis say, "Wow, I don't know." I mean, that's not a thing you hear a lot of rabbis say right off the bat, but most of them started by saying, I'm not a professional, I really know nothing about this. I would probably just pass them on to a professional. But, even so, and that was a case where we reached out specifically. Sometimes they would pass us along to rabbis that they knew had specifically pastoral experience, or rabbis who were also doctors, or rabbis who were also psychologists. But some of our own rabbis turned out to be very deeply versed, very, very deeply experienced in pastoral care of various kinds. I learned more about these rabbis than I had known before. A lot of them had in fact had experience with this kind of thing. We had a question once. We wanted to know. It was basically a question about should Jews bother other Jews about their religious choices, and we were trying to avoid the word proselytize because, that's sort of a Christian word. And we wanted to ask the question in a way that wouldn't make people mad. And so we ended up with some very complicated question like, is it appropriate for Jews to challenge other Jews on their choices, which are less or more observant? And we got pretty good answers on this. And actually, not everyone agreed. Some rabbis thought it was fine to push Jews to be more observant, or less observant for that matter. But for whatever reason, the header, that we had a one word header in the magazine layout, and that one word turned out to be proselytizing. And so sure enough, we got the letter. It's like, why are you using that word? That's not a good word for this. Jews don't proselytize. So it's tricky. I mean, I would say no, there aren't questions that we'd shy away from. We like annoying questions.
Well, keep at it. You seem to be getting some good responses. A question came in that said, have you ever asked about assisted death?
We did once. It's not in the book. We asked a question about. The question was something like, how does Jewish tradition help in counseling on end of life issues? It was a little mealy mouthed, I think, the way it came out. I'd probably ask it a little more, in a little more pointed way today. We did ask. We got a lot of answers that kind of overlapped with the question in the book, which is about organ donation. A lot of the answers about organ donation speak to this question of when is someone actually dead, and the organ donation question. I mean, I guess I can't remember off the top of my head exactly how the answers broke down in the end of life care, although a lot of it was more pastoral. A lot of them talked about things people are worrying about, right, when they're on the point of death. What kinds of counseling they need, whether are they worried about an afterlife, are they worried about their relationships with their children, is there unfinished business, what does Jewish tradition say about that kind of thing. But the organ donation question did focus the rabbis on, among other things, sort of the interplay of religious tenets with science. And one of the interesting aspects of that, the question was asked. I think the question was asked a while back, like in 2008, and a lot has changed since then. But even by then, for many years, people had taken it for granted that Jewish law forbade organ donation, particularly Orthodox. You couldn't give your organs for having to do with theories about what happens after death and whether you need your body, for resurrection or something like that. A variety of folk beliefs that are also somewhat theological. And over the period, over really like the previous decade, there'd been repeated returns by Orthodox theorists to this question. This Yitz Greenberg, the modern Orthodox rabbi, described the evolution of this one well-known juror, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who had come back 3 or 4 times to the same question as the science on brain death evolved. First he was against it, then he was against it, except in certain cases, but a lot, and apparently even since that question was asked, there's been a little bit of a return to concerns about, as scientists come up with different ways of reading what brain death and when brain death occurs and what that means for the organs, the rabbis continue to issue new responsa. And to me, that's very interesting and educational about how Judaism really works. So I don't know if that's really helpful on end of life. I mean,
No, I think that was a great answer to that. Another question that just came through was, is there a question that you haven't asked yet that you really want to ask? And I kind of want to put another question in there. I'm just wondering, as you're talking, you're saying this is such a longevity, this series. Do you ever reuse questions, but just going to different rabbis and maybe things that are going on differently? Or you're always looking for new questions?
Right. We have.
So the first part was a question that you are wanting to ask but haven't yet. Part 1.
So I think there are always new questions. That's what keeps this all alive. I mean, I think again, sometimes you ask a new question, but it echoes a previous question, like this business about end of life. I mean, I guess you could say we've asked it now 3 or 4 different ways, but the question, actually, I was giving a talk earlier this week. Someone was interviewing me about this book, and she said, apropos of the news, what do the rabbis say about mobs? And I said, gosh, I don't know what the rabbis would say about mobs. And I don't know exactly what the question is. I mean, I don't think asking it that way would necessarily get good answers, but if we could tighten it down in some way, make it a clearer question, like, when do rabbis consider mob violence? What do rabbis say? Does the tradition say anything about mob violence? I just think it would be an interesting question. I presume Jews are against mob violence, given our history. I mean, it might not be that interesting a question in terms of the answers, but it might. I mean, I was thinking, we've asked this question before. We've asked a version of this question actually before the pandemic. We asked, we were kind of pleased about this too in retrospect. We asked a question about virtual presence in Jewish community and ritual. This was before we all got driven onto Zoom, when things were still normal. We'd been talking about how several synagogues that we were aware of had been talking about the halacha of live streaming services. This was all going on previously in the conservative movement, particularly, and it seemed like a good time to ask some. So I think the question was, it's not in the book because we didn't put the questions in the book that were too sort of sensitive to the news. We wanted things that would still be, that wouldn't go out of date. But so the question was something like, what role does virtual presence play in Jewish ritual and Jewish community? And we got kind of an interesting range of answers. Most rabbis were okay with live streaming, but for sure not all. Obviously the Orthodox were not in favor of live streaming on Shabbat the way they aren't now. And one of the rabbis who was most, interestingly enough, one of the rabbis of our rabbis, the one of the ones who was most against live streaming for services, not for reasons of halacha, but just because she felt it really took people away from the moment. Um, Here we are a year later. Her services, her online services, are among the best I've seen. Just wonderful, inspired online services. So you just never know. So I'd kind of like to go back. We might do this winter and say, kind of what have we learned about virtual Judaism? What will we keep from virtual Judaism? Um, so I think that's something we'll ask the rabbis.
That's interesting that you explored that before, as you're saying, before the pandemic and everyone went virtual. So I think that would be something to go back, I think, and see everybody's reaction and different opinions that they have now. Kind of, I thought of something as you were just speaking. Do you find yourself always kind of wanting to have a little notebook and something to write down? It's like you're in conversation with somebody, and then all of a sudden you're like, "This would be a really great question for the Ask the Rabbis column."
Oh, for
How do you
sure.
come up with the questions, or do they just, you feel like it's always kind of going on in your head? You're thinking that way in question form now?
Well, I mean, the questions often, I don't write all the questions. They often emerge from the editorial meetings, and some of the best ones come from my colleagues. The title question came from Nadine Epstein, the editor in chief, who also invented this column. So she gets a lot of the credit. But it's true. I mean, thinking about this kind of thing, it's good company. I mean, I used to, for many years before I came to Moment, I used to write an op-ed column, a syndicated column for the Washington Post, and a column is like that. It's always company. You're always kind of thinking about it. And people used to tease me because if I'd be in a conversation with someone, with a friend, and they'd say something, and I'd say, "Ooh, that's interesting. That's really interesting." And they'd be like, "Oh no, okay, I see, I hear that. That's the column sound." So I think that's similar. Sometimes you'll be going. It's true. Sometimes you'll be talking to someone, and you'll be like, "Wait, that's kind of interesting," you know. And they'll say, "There she goes again."
Thank you. I just had something come through from Scott in the Q&A, and he asked, "What if you could share some of the responses to the title question?"
Ah, yes. I was hoping someone would ask that. I mean, for whatever reason, it's not in my presentation. But so a lot of people start by saying, why in the world ask this question? It's kind of a silly question, and it was the summer. We can ask in the summer. You can ask kind of summer questions. Um, it's it's really a way of getting at a couple of I think interesting and important questions. One is it's partly it's about artificial intelligence, which is a rising force in life, and obviously affects a lot of things, and is philosophically kind of hard to get your mind around. So to ask the question this way, can a robot be Jewish, is you have to ask yourself what it means to be human. It's an exercise in line drawing in a couple of ways. What does it mean for do you, the humanist rabbi starts by saying, well, to answer this question, we first have to ask what does it mean to be human, and then he talks about Star Trek and Isaac Asimov, which a lot of people do. Several rabbis referred to a very well known moment in Star Trek: The New Generation, where Lieutenant Data, the android crew member, is actually there's a trial to determine whether he's a human being or whether he's human in the sense that whether he has free will, and several rabbis alluded to that. But and then you have to ask, separate from the question of what makes someone human, what makes someone Jewish, and these are questions that they lie deep enough. People don't always people often have answers, but they're not sure why. And so this is a way of getting at that. I will say that it turns out I should have known this, but I really didn't. Is that a lot of people who later grow up to be rabbis in their teenage years they're science fiction geeks because think about it. If you have kind of an interest in the big questions, that's an obvious direction to go, is to read a lot of science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction as a teenager, but my impression from the rabbis was that even the most orthodox rabbis were very, very well versed in sci-fi, and two of them, Yitz Greenberg, the modern Orthodox, and Hayam Ovadia, who is our Sephardic rabbi at the moment, they both responded by composing basically pastiche, by composing a little bit of sci-fi. Rabbi Yitz had an actual dialogue with his rabbi where they're arguing over whether the rabbi is Jewish, whether the robot is Jewish. And the rabbi says, what makes you think you're Jewish? And the robot says, I played the Jewish robot in Star Wars. And the rabbi says, there wasn't a Jewish robot in Star Wars. And he says, yes, there was. He worried, or, C-3PO, he worried all the time. Of course he was Jewish, that kind of thing. So just like shtick. But the other Orthodox rabbi, Yitzhak Adlerstein, said, I'm on a Beit Din, and a Beit Din asks, do you have a Jewish mother? And do you have a Jewish soul? And, obviously, we don't have any Jewish mother robots. And last I checked, Bill Gates couldn't construct a Jewish soul, so no. So that was his approach. But some of the rabbis who were not sci-fi geeks, two of them, a unusually high number, often one rabbi will call me up and say, what is this question? What? What do you want from me? What are you asking me? In this case, several rabbis called me up and asked me that. And one of them said, I just have no idea what you're talking about here. What are you looking for with this question? We talked about it a little bit, and she said, well, sometimes I feel like my dog is Jewish. What about that? And I said, yeah, let's go with that, explore that a little bit. And she wrote this lovely thing about how, her dog was always the most excited member of the household about Shabbat. Her dog loved Shabbat, would come and watch the candles being lit and so forth. And she ended up finding some text that says that anything loved and taken care of by Jews during his or her life could develop a Jewish neshama, a Jewish soul, and even a doll could have a Jewish soul, if it's loved and taken care of by Jews. And so, why not a dog? And she ended by saying, we've always been a mixed multitude. There's plenty of blessing to go around, which I thought was really, really quite lovely. And, and then the independent rabbi, it brought up the golem. Several of them brought up the fact, Jewish tradition contains a lot of stories about the golem, which is an artificial being created out of clay by certain types of mystical rabbis, typically for the defense of the community. The most famous one is the Golem of Prague, who was supposedly, if you've ever been to Prague, you'll see this legend described in the synagogue. Rabbi Judah Loew, a great mystic, creates this golem out of clay by the riverside and brings him to life to protect the community from a pogrom, and afterwards has to take life away from him again because he's become large and powerful. So it really is a kind of a Frankenstein's monster story. And the golem becomes a very interesting figure also in Talmudic discussion. There are elaborate discussions in the Talmud over whether a golem can count in a minyan. So there's the question, right? Can a robot be Jewish? So it's not, there's really a quintessentially modern question asked and debated in the Talmud in the 16th century. So that sort of thing's very enjoyable. This is Rabbi Winkler, the independent. He found arguments both ways, and then he ended with something I really thought was quite charming, which was he said that if a golem is Jewish, then it must be Reform Jewish because plainly it's created by a male rabbi. So this descent would have to be patrilinear. So a robot could be Jewish, but it would have to be Reform. We highlight this question because it captures some of what's enjoyable about this kind of, about the liveliness of the tradition, really, and the ways you can find wisdom sometimes, slant, not where you expected it.
Great, thank you. As you're talking about it, you can just really see how much you enjoy your job, and I'm sitting here thinking it must be so fun, not only, you know, coming up with the question, but just sitting and reading all the responses that you get from everybody. So I think a final question that I'd like to end on for the evening is just, why do you suppose that the Ask the Rabbis is so popular?
So it's nice of you to offer me a way to why everyone should read the book, right? Well, I think for one thing, I think Jews are, in a weird way, I think we're proud of how capacious this tradition is and this religion is, and we're proud of the fact that in Judaism there's no single right answer. It's very satisfying to see how many different ways you can answer a question and still be within within the tradition and within the religion. I my son's Muslim roommate at college had a look at this over his shoulder and said something like, "I don't know if this would work with imams." I don't know. And after that, I thought, "Oh, wouldn't it be fun to do that? To try it? Like, ask the imams. Wouldn't that be a blast?" Just to see if it could be done. But it's so I think it showcases something very attractive about the Jewish tradition. It showcases, as I said before, civil dispute, disagreement without hatred. It's not the full range. Obviously, there are people out beyond the the rabbis we're talking to who aren't so tolerant of other Jews' opinions. But it's a very strong strain in the tradition, and also, I think it's a really easy way to learn a lot very fast because these things are highly condensed and highly focused. You can read them, and you will, obviously, it's just the beginning. It's just scratching the surface, but you will have a kind of a sense of the ways the argument has gone. You'll have a handful of key texts on a subject, and it's a great starting point. And I think everyone wants a starting point for something as vast as Jewish learning. It's always nice to have kind of a well-defined thing you can just pick up and look at and learn something. So, for what it's worth, that's why
I think that was the perfect answer. I can't help but sit here now, again, that we're all Zooming and virtual, kind of in my mind thinking how it would be to actually have a live version, a little bit of, a few different.
Live. We have Limmud New York's just entered into a quarterly arrangement with us, so we've only done one so far. They're tricky, actually. It's much harder to do these in person, but worthwhile,
Did you find that people were a little bit more hesitant, to answer anything, or just?
No, it wasn't that. We had we're just feeling our way here. We have to learn to do this in a completely different way. But it was a question we asked recently: should Jews support reparations for African Americans? And we kind of asked it in the Yom Kippur space. We were, is this part of Teshuvah? And if so, from whom to whom? And we had a bunch of rabbis who thought it was a yes, and then we had one rabbi arguing that it was a no, and they kind of ganged up on him, and it got a little nasty. And I felt like that was a session that ended just in time. But I would know better next time. I mean, I would learn, and I think the next one is in February, and I think we'll talk about whether Jews believe in miracles, and it'll be much more civilized. So.
Well, it should be interesting. I'm assuming all that can be found on the Moment magazine website then? The events would be listed?
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Good. Well, Amy, thank you again for tonight. This was really wonderful. I just want to let everybody know, if you haven't read the book, I just did post a couple minutes ago a link to the chat where you can purchase a copy of the book. I believe it's through Moment Magazine, and it would be a signed copy by Amy. And again, Moment does wonderful events throughout the year. I know the JCC has shared many of the Zoominars on Tuesdays, as well as, options to subscribe to the magazine. So please take a look at the website and support them. Again, thank you to Moment Magazine. It's been a pleasure working with them. Especially, I want to say thank you to Susan Borden and Debbie Sand for their help with the series. And just a reminder that we do still have 2 events remaining. On Monday, January 18th, we have Bob Mankoff, who is the former New Yorker cartoon editor, and he will be presenting Have I Got a Cartoon for You?, the Moment Magazine book of Jewish cartoons. And then we'll be closing the series on Thursday, January 21st, with playwright Nancy Davidoff Kelton, and it'll be a play reading of Finding Mr. Rightstein and then a talk back. And the play reading will be presented with the Jewish Repertory Theater, which is part of the Buffalo Jewish Community Center. So again, thank you, everybody. It was a great evening, wonderful questions, and wishing you all a good night. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks.